You don't usually see people swapping out independent rear suspension in favor of a solid rear axle. Solid rear axle is ancient technology, unless you're a Jeep person, in which case it is cutting-edge technology. Usually designs move toward independent rear suspension, the Ford Mustang, the Chevy Silverado, but most of the real off-road focused vehicles still use it in the back. It's a simpler design that's trusted for reliability, and there's a significant aftermarket for parts. For me, it just packages better. Also, it's cheaper, which is good because so far this year I've spent more money on the Viper project than I've made on YouTube. Anyway, here's an ad. This episode is sponsored by Factor. I don't cook. Well, I don't usually cook. There was that one time I made a sandwich in the garage with questionable results. But I don't normally cook. Mostly I'd rather just spend my time doing something else. Most of the alternatives to cooking are not great. But then there's Factor. Factor meals arrive pre-prepared, never frozen, and they're ready to eat in 2 minutes. No grocery shopping, no cutting, peeling, chopping, washing, super easy cleanup. With 34 plus chef-prepared, dietitian-approved weekly options, there's always something new to try. Plus, you can round out your meal and replenish your snack supply with an assortment of 45 plus add-on options. Factor offers keto, calorie smart, chef's choice, that's the one I get, and vegan plus veggie options. I am good at some things. Planning, buying, and preparing good meals is not one of those things. So I have outsourced it, and now I can eat tasty, dietitian-approved meals every day with almost no effort. And if you watch this channel, you know how much I love good things that require almost no effort. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code SUPERFAST50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. That's factor75.com and code SUPERFAST50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. A few weeks ago, we talked about the front suspension, and that was all pretty straightforward. The basic geometry is the same as what came on the Viper, double A-arms, coilover shocks, just sort of redesigned for off-road and rebuilt. The rear suspension is a wild and confusing mess. It is nothing like a Dodge Viper rear suspension and has more in common with a Ford Bronco than anything, even though the axle is from a Jeep. I'm not doing a lot of building on this video. This is a design video giving you a glimpse into the Superfast Matt design process, balancing engineering, fabrication, performance, ADHD, and poop jokes, all into one system. The original plan for the rear suspension was basically the same as the front suspension. Just take the control arms and uprights off, make new control arms and uprights, attach springs and driveshafts somehow, and send it. But this got a little more complicated as soon as I spent more than 5 seconds looking at the Viper. The biggest problem is the angle of the half shafts. We're looking at a lift somewhere around 10 inches. A little under 2 of that comes from the taller tires, but most comes from moving the tires down. This puts the axles at a really high angle, and that's just at ride height. With the suspension drooped all the way down, it gets really bad. One thing we can do to mitigate this is to also move the differential down. This makes the angles on the half shafts better by adding some angle to the main drive shaft. Fine, except now the axles go right through this frame rail here. It's super in the way. There's really no way around it. This section of the frame has to go. This adds other issues, like the fact that this part of the frame back here now has no rigidity, and I kind of need to connect the rear lower control arms right here. I could design a trailing A-arm for the bottom, maybe connecting to the rear right here, but I would also need to drop the point down to get good geometry, and to get an upright that would clear the drive shaft. So now my loads are all indirect and cantilevered, and it just looks weird. If I have to cut out this section of the frame anyway, why not just use a solid rear axle? They're way more common off-road, there's a lot more options for gear ratios and lockers and upgraded everything, so the search was on. The first axle I looked at was a 4Runner. They have great off-road capability in my experience, and there was one in my driveway for me to look at. I passed on this pretty quickly, mostly because it's too narrow. The Viper needs a flange-to-flange width of about 69 inches. Nice. The 4Runner was less than that, and I could have used wheel spacers, but that just adds a lot of bending load into the axles. I rented a Bronco and scanned that. I talked about that last time. It would have been great, but all the brackets and links were in the wrong places. I went to a dealership and took some measurements off an F-150. I did the same with a Ram 1500. I looked at the Viper truck. I looked at a Raptor, the Wrangler Rubicon, and the Gladiator. I even considered some aftermarket solutions. In the end, I chose this, a Jeep Wrangler Rubicon rear axle. This turned out to be pretty good all around. It had the mounts for the links in the right places, it has a huge aftermarket, the Rubicon axle in particular is wider and just about the right width, and you can buy it new from Jeep complete with an electronic locker, brakes, and everything for just over $2,000. Is it the best solution? Maybe, maybe not, but it's what we're going with. Some of you might be pointing out that the Viper has about 500 pound-feet of torque, which is more than the Jeep, but the Jeep has a low-range gearbox, and low-range gearboxes multiply torque. So while the Viper has a lot more torque at the crankshaft, the Jeep Wrangler has a lot more torque at the driveshaft, even when you consider the four-wheel drive split. If the rear end can handle the low-range Jeep torque, it can handle the Viper torque. Probably. Either way, we're going to find out. I should note here that I didn't actually design the suspension linkage before I bought this axle. I did kind of look at it and kind of decide that it would probably work. When I got around to actually drawing things up in CAD, it started to look less of a good idea. You can kind of see the main issue when I overlay the scans of the Jeep over the Viper. The mounts for the rear suspension are sort of inside the driver. There's not a lot of space to put the trailing links. They're just too long. The lower links are not bad because they kind of need to be below the bottom of the Viper frame, so I added this C channel going across the car, welded it to the frame. This channel has tabs coming off the lower links. The upper links want to be mounted inside the car, directly to the spinal cord of the driver. As this is not an ideal situation, I shortened the links and tried to mount them to the frame inside the wheel well. Unfortunately, there is a frame rail right in the way. Unfortunately? Or fortunately? See, I can just put this joint right inside the frame tube. It seems like a bad idea, and it probably is, but it is a pretty direct load path to the frame since it is the frame. So I drew up a pocket and cutout for the frame, added some reinforcements and welds around it. This would mean the bolt would have to be carefully installed from another hole cut in the frame, and the nut would have to be welded inside, but it could work with a smaller rod end. I finished drawing out all the structure, including triangulating the load paths back to the main lower frame rails, and then I looked at it and I hated it. The Jeep wants trailing links that are long. The Bronco had nicer, shorter trailing links, but they were in the wrong places. Kind of. They were in the wrong places side to side, but I could sort of mimic the Bronco rear suspension geometry, but using the Jeep rear axle. Suspension geometry is a way to understand what your suspension is doing and how the forces from your tires and your vehicle's mass might be affecting each other. It's mostly triangles, so it's usually just suspension trigonometry. Except when your control arms are nearly parallel and your instant center ends up in Berlin. Then it's called suspension geography. Suspension geometry is a black art. It's basically witchcraft, like acupuncture or baking. People say that they understand it, but they don't. I dug through literally tens of YouTube videos trying to understand this stuff. Most of the information out there is just sort of rules of thumb that don't really explain what's going on. They just tell you to draw lines and dots and make your dots this or that far away from your line. I was pleasantly surprised to see my old coworker Hubert making suspension videos. Hubert is a smart dude, and these are great videos on the subject. You should watch them if you're interested. If, like me, you are only interested insofar as it relates to shoving a Jeep axle under a Dodge Viper, then I will distill down the details here with crayons and sarcasm. This is a rear axle. It is attached with 4 links mirrored symmetrically. You have the uppers and the lowers. These points are attached to the frame. These points are attached to the axle. If you look at it from the side, you can draw dotted lines through the links and they will intersect up here somewhere. This is your instant center. It's as though the car and rear axle are connected at a hinge right here. It's called an instant center because as the axle moves, it also moves, so it's only here at this instant. This line here, drawn from the rear tire contact patch to the intersection between the front axle and the center of gravity. This vertical line is here because this is a rear-wheel drive car. If you're all-wheel drive, then this moves back based on your torque split front to rear. If you are running independent rear suspension, then this line starts at the center of the rear axle. If you have a front-wheel drive car, then ditch all the lines because none of this matters and nobody cares. If your instant center is above this line, then the rear of your car will move up during acceleration, pushing your tires down and raising the back of the car like a cat in heat. If your instant center is below this line, then accelerating will squish the rear suspension and the rear of the car will drop down like a dog taking a poo. What you want depends on the kind of driving you're going to be doing. If you're going to be doing a lot of high-speed desert running, you usually want full-on dog poo. Rock crawling and trail running usually does best with a little less dog poo. Drag racing will usually go the other way with full-on cat in heat. This is why the parachute on drag cars kind of looks like a cat's, well, never mind. Anyway, I don't really know what I'm shooting for here. Most of the info out there are just rules of thumb. Off-roading is one of those areas where there are a lot of people who will tell you the right way to do things, but who won't be able to tell you why it's the right way to do it. If you know a thing is true, but you can't explain why it's true, then you don't know that thing. You believe that thing. I believe Ford engineers know things, so I just looked at the Bronco, sketched it out, and kind of copied it. You can see my instant center follows a path lower than the Bronco's instant center, but that's because my center of gravity is lower. I also added some adjustability in so I can change it from dog to cat just in case. So once I got the pivot points in places that made sense for the kinematics and also for mounting, I started drawing out all the mounting points. The lowers need a whole new frame tube to be added, so I ran this tube across the car. It is welded to the main frame rails in the middle and the outer frame rails below the exhaust. That tube is also supported with some extra tubes going forward to the middle frame tubes. The upper mounts need to come off of this frame tube here, but since this tube is kind of flimsy looking, I decided to tie that mount back down into the lower tube that I added. The links are also offset, so I added 3 of them running down, connecting multiple frame pieces together. I added a few extra holes so I can make some adjustments to the rear geometry if I want to, and I sent it off to be laser cut by Send Cut Send. It looks kind of busy, admittedly, and I'm not in love with it, but that might just be because it's red. Oh yeah, that's way better. While I was at it, I ran a couple more tubes up to this frame section up here. I did this because while designing all of this, I decided to switch to coilover suspension in the rear. The original plan was the same as the Jeep, a shock mounted on the back of the axle going up to the rear frame and a spring sitting on top of the axle going to a frame rail. There were a couple of problems with this. One is that the spring perches are in the wrong place, right below the frame here with too little space to squish a spring. I need them to be here where the bump stop landings are. I could just weld spring perches over the bump stop landings, but then I would also need to weld spring landings onto the frame. Doable, but kind of a pain, and I also lose the place for my bump stops. Also, the shock doesn't quite work going to the original coilover mount, so I would need to add more mounting back here somewhere, and since I'm cutting out that big chunk of the frame, I'd like to keep all the loads in front of the axle if I can. What I can do is use a coilover and run it right up to the frame up here. To get the travel that I want, this puts the bottom of the coilover below the axle, but this is not a big deal and not too uncommon in off-road vehicles. In fact, a lot of trophy trucks and pre-runners do this. They run the bottom of the coilover to the lower link. And since I'm building my lower link, why not put a spot for a coilover? I haven't drawn this out in detail yet, mostly because I haven't received the coilovers, but the basic idea is there. A big spherical uniball in the back, just like the front suspension, and a threaded rod end in the front. The upper link will just be a rod end on one side and some polyurethane bushings on the other. This setup does change the load paths. Normally, the weight of the vehicle is supported right here, but now it will be supported by this flange coming off the bottom. It does look like a pretty beefy flange. Also, my bump stops will be in the same location as was designed by Jeep, so the really high loads will be going right into the top of the axle. I assume the Jeep engineers did their homework on this bump stop location. I am relying on the competence of automotive engineers a lot with this design. Should have used a Toyota axle. The drive shaft could be an issue here. You see, normally a drive shaft is several feet long, and normally the rear end only moves a few inches up or down. On an off-road vehicle, the axle moves more than a few inches, and on a Viper, the drive shaft is less than 2 feet long. This presents some problems similar to what we were looking at earlier with the half shafts. This can be mitigated with one simple trick, pointing the transmission output at the axle. Normally a Dodge Viper has the transmission output pointed at the differential, but we move the differential down about 10 inches. So to make this work, we will need to point the transmission output at the new differential, and to do that, we will need to angle down the entire engine and transmission assembly. This is actually pretty easy, I think. I haven't finished this yet, so it might be super hard and I'm just a moron. But I think all I need to do is make a new transmission mount. I might need to make new engine mounts as well, and I might also need to make some slight modifications to the exhaust, but we'll cross those bridges when we get there. For the time being, I drew up this new transmission mount. It's a lot stronger than the last one by a fair bit. It also has adjustability. I didn't really need to put these holes in here, but it was easy, so why not? Once this is installed and the engine and transmission assembly is tilted down, we're halfway there. I'll nose the rear axle up a little bit so they're parallel. This will work just fine with normal ride height driving, but this axle is designed to move up and down a lot, about a foot total. I set up the kinematics for the rear end so that the pinion is always pointing pretty nearly at the transmission, so that should be fine, but the transmission side of the drive shaft will see high angles. U-joints are not really great at high angles. There are some that will work at those extreme angles, but often those don't like high speed. What some off-roaders will do is line up their rear end with their drive shaft and use a double U-joint on the transmission side. This double cardan joint gives more angle than a single joint, and you can usually minimize your rear joint angle with suspension geometry. You always want to offset your U-joints to cancel out vibrations, but this double joint cancels itself out. It just means that the rear U-joint needs to be mostly straight most of the time. I started looking around for CV joints. CV joints are great because they can be used at higher angles and higher speeds with a decent amount of torque. They also don't have the vibrations and changing velocity that a U-joint has at higher angles. Anyway, I was looking around trying to figure out which vehicles are using CV joints on the drive shaft these days, what angles they were running at, and what torque they were seeing. And guess what vehicle I found that uses a CV joint on the drive shaft? The Jeep Wrangler. The rear end that I bought has a flange for the CV all ready to go. Problem solved. Maybe. Maybe not. There are some stories online about people blowing up their Jeep Driveshaft CV joints, and there are kits to swap out to a double U joint. Some people suggest doing this if you lift your Jeep and put bigger tires on it. There doesn't seem to be any suggestions on what to do when you install your Jeep rear axle in a Viper. It seems like the failures on these joints come from the fact that the rubber boots flex and tear, allowing water to get in and obliterate the nicely lubricated joint. This makes sense, and there are companies that sell upgrades for higher flex on the boots. It's hard to find good data on this stuff. The easy thing to do here might be to just build 2 drive shafts and put a spare in the trunk to get me home after the first one explodes. Then I can upgrade from there. Remember earlier how I had figured out all those links to hold the rear suspension to the car? Well, I missed one. The axle is pretty well constrained here, but it's not very well constrained from moving side to side. In fact, it's not constrained at all. Most of the time these days, axles are constrained side to side with what's called a Panhard bar or a track bar. This bar mounts to the frame on one side and the rear axle on the other side and just keeps it from moving side to side. Actually, that's not true. Since the bar moves in an arc, the axle moves side to side just a little bit, but the bar keeps it constrained to this arc. Unfortunately, with the Viper, I don't have a good place to put a Panhard bar. The only place for me to put it is in the back here, and since I cut out this part of the frame, the lower piece here is doing jack squat. So if I go fast into a corner, my axle will just rip right off the car, sending me sideways and on fire into the side of a Wendy's. I could come down off this upper frame rail, but I need this bar to be kind of horizontal, so it'd have to come way down, and now the load paths are really long and bendy, and everything is as stiff as a wet noodle. You don't need a Panhard bar if you do a triangulated 4-link, just angle the top bars way out. Unfortunately, I don't have room for this unless I lift the car another foot or so. There is another alternative called a Watts link. A Watts link has 2 bars coming from either side of the car to a bell crank that's mounted to the differential. This allows the axle to move up and down, but not side to side. This is better than the Panhard bar because the axle can move up and down without doing that arc thing. It's also better because the load is shared between 2 sides of the frame instead of all going into one point. A typical Watts link is mounted to the rear of the differential. This doesn't help me because I still don't have a lot of structure back here. What I really need is a Watts link in front of the axle. Unfortunately, that's where the drive shaft is, but I might be able to move it in front and slightly above the axle. That would put my roll center above the axle, which would be better for reasons that I can't explain because I don't understand. I believe it would be better. However, the only way this fits is if I rotate the bell crank 90 degrees and lay it down flat. I've seen a couple of people with their Watts linkage set up like this, but it seems like it wouldn't work. It should be fine at normal ride height and when the axle is rotated, but when it goes up and down, the axis rotates like this, and then I think this is the roll axis, which kind of needs to be pointing straight forward, or straight-ish forward. Okay, but what if I used 2 pivots and then put them on the frame instead of the axle? What if I just used 2 rods going out from a middle point out to 2 pivots connected to opposite sides? Then I could have another link going between the 2 pivots set up like this. When the axle goes up, it pushes both of the rods away. This one rotates clockwise and this one also clockwise. This bar in the middle here just moves to the right. When the axle goes down, the rods move the other direction and this middle rod here just moves to the left. But if you try to move the whole axle to the left, this rod tries to pivot this clockwise while this one tries to move this counterclockwise, and this bar in the middle can't compress, so nothing happens. It works just like a Watts linkage, but it works without needing the pivot axis longitudinally on the axle. Also, you can very easily change your roll center by just moving this point up or down. I think I've invented a new suspension, and since I invented it, I get to name it. I shall call it the Matt's linkage. It has all the benefits of a Watts linkage with no drawbacks. Unfortunately, it has several drawbacks. One is that it is technically constrained from moving forward or backward as well. This probably isn't a problem since axles only move forward or back a tiny bit, but it will cause some extra stress in the links. You get some compression here in the left Matt's link and the right Matt's link, which will transmit the load through the Matt Ego rounds into the Panhard Bar. Again, if the axle doesn't swing too far forward or back, this probably won't be an issue, but you will have to now package 2 Matt Ego rounds, each with its own rotational bearing, and 3 spherical bearings attached to the Matt links. So essentially, I've solved one small packaging issue by introducing several other packaging problems and about 12 additional failure points. I kind of want to build it anyway. But after I spent all this time designing the Matt's link, I realized I might be wrong about this top pivot Watts link. I'm not sure if this is the roll center. I actually don't know where the roll center is in this design, and I have no idea what's going on with this thing. That Panhard bar is looking pretty good right now, but maybe I'll go with this top pivot Watts link thing and just hope it works. No, I will believe that it works. Because believing is engineering. Believing is not engineering.
It used to be that you had to impress people to get people to watch your show. Now you just have to impress the algorithm. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. All hail the algorithm.